Right, thanks. Thanks. Okay. Right, thank you and welcome everyone. Mine is going to be a little bit more visual. I tend to use more a sensorial type of presentation. So to begin with, what I'd like to do is acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, past and present, the Wurundjeri clan of the Kulin Nation on the land that we're on. But I'd also like to acknowledge the Italian elders who have participated in my research as part of my PhD, two of which are here today and who are an integral part of the presentation that I have at the moment. So the talk will focus on some elements that are quite emotive that may raise some issues for people. Now, the reason why I'm raising this is because I don't know your background or what's happened in your lives or your family's lives, but if I trigger something that's emotional and you need to leave the room, please do so, and we'll chat about it afterwards. So it won't be a counselling session, but it'll help. Okay, oh, it's okay. So it's gone back to the.
It's all right.
Slideshow.
Yeah.
Click the top.
Keep on going. You just know it.
Yeah. Right. So
Press enter
Yep.
to back first. So we'll go back to slideshow.
Yep.
Click slideshow.
And then just press enter.
Okay.
I might turn the lights off.
Yeah. All right. So what I'm going to do is the presentation will be a brief overview of internment and how Italians were interned in Australia, as Nicole actually did most of that work for me. And then I'll follow with a presentation on two families who were interned at Tatura Camp in Victoria, which is about 2.5 hours north from here. And two people who were born at Tatura as stateless deportees of the British are in this room with us today. And then I'll examine some of the salient features of how this internment affected these two diasporas that I'm going to discuss, and how that sort of impacts on our Italian-Australian diaspora history. But it'll just be a really quick 20-minute rush. Okay, so firstly, in Australia, the number of official interned Italians was official interned enemy aliens of all nations was around about 12,000, although figures tend to vary, even up to 18,000 with detainees that came from other places. For example, the Taiwanese who were actually brought here by the Americans in 1942, and the Javanese who were brought here by the Dutch in 1942. So I'm not going to discuss those groups, but of those interned 12,000 official figures, I'm just going to use official figures for now. 5,000 more or less were Italians, and they were interned in prison camps. I'm excluding the 10 or more thousand Italians who were sent to the bush camps that I've labelled bush camps in the bush, where they were chopping wood and building roads and railways, okay? So I'm not including those. I'm just including the ones who were detained in camps. Of those, the blue section are the detainees who were brought here by the British and the French. There are only a few brought here by the French. So what we're going to be looking at today is the blue area, the 600 to 800 people who are brought here, and I'm only going to be looking at a very small group of about 250, 280 internees from Palestine and from the Malacca Straits. So of the 5,000 Italians who are here, this is how I've divided them, just looking at the official figures. The Malacca Straits families, around about 100, but in those there were merchant seamen, and then halfway through the war they were transferred into the prisoner of war camps. So there are all sorts of reasons for that. New Guinean Italian gold miners. I've excluded those because that was a different cohort. But the Malacca Straits and the what I call the Levantine Italo-Palestinians, that is the Levantine Italians who had settled in Palestine for generations, I've labelled that group the Italo-Palestinians to separate them from the Levantine groups in Turkey and Egypt and other places. So this is where the groups came from, but the Italians from Palestine, actually quite a large number came from Haifa, a few came from Jerusalem, and then a few were in remote or what would be different areas in the farmlands of Palestine. I haven't researched the full extent of why they were there, but the families that we're going to be looking at, one family is from Haifa, okay, and the other family from the Straits of Malacca is Claudia's family. Her parents were taken from, or her father was taken from Penang, where he had settled, and her mother was also from Penang, but they were actually taken from Changi prison and brought to Australia in 1940. So these are the groups. Okay, so the camps, numerous official camps, there are a lot of unofficial secret camps throughout Australia, including secret camps where Indigenous Australians were sent. And then eventually some of the Indigenous Australians ended up in Palm Island, but they were unofficial camps. So the camp that we're going to look at is here in Victoria, and it was the only official family camp where families were kept. They were segregated. There was an apartheid segregation where the Asians or the coloured people were separated from the Europeans, and the Europeans were called Caucasians. In the different camps, what you had is segregation of the ethnicities and the language groups. And then within, for example, the Italian language groups, you had segregation again according to various different family customs, traditions, home language, religion, etc. So this is Tatura Camp 3. And the people that I have researched were in this camp here, Camp 3A. Okay, so Camp 3, according to the research, was around about 150 metres wide by about 300 long, so not very big. Okay, so the two groups that I've clustered are the Italo-Palestinians and the Malacca Straits Italians. Let's talk about the Malacca Straits Italians to begin with. They were actually a group of about 80 to 100 people who were clustered and in the Malacca Straits areas, one or two people from Borneo, Brunei, etc., farmers. So the Malacca Straits and Italo-Palestinians were sent to this camp here. It was an Italian-only camp. They were separated from the Australian Italians. Australian Italians and the overseas, the British deportees did not communicate, basically. Towards 1943, the armistice, there was a bit more communication and they did open the gates. But that was basically because that camp was run by quite a benevolent commandant, and the guards were quite benevolent. So the interaction between, let's say, the German Templars and the Italians seems to have happened somewhere along the line, but not at the beginning. Okay, so this is the camp. Now, what I've done is I've clustered photographs that I've taken from the Australian War Memorial of the detainees in Camp 3A, which were the overseas detainees. Amongst these are the Italo-Palestinians. Rick's family is here, and I don't think I've included Claudia's family, but what you have here is a clustering of images that give an impression, and this was supposed to be a good day when their photographs were taken in 1943, of how people were feeling on the day. It's only a nano minute or a second, but if you can see here, there is no happiness.
Of course not.
Yet the dominant narrative of the Tatura camp was that it was a happy camp, that it was a wonderful camp, that they were looked after so wonderfully, and that life was fantastic. Well, in comparison to Auschwitz, yes. But if we look at people who are non-combatants and children, not a single photograph of a child in the dozens of images that I've seen has a child that is smiling. So my question was, wow, you know, my research was on the men who were interned at Loveday in South Australia, but then I realised what we had here. We had a situation where for many years these people were confined to an area of, 300 square metres. From 1940, the Malacca Straits Italians, and 1941, the Palestinian Italians, till 1946. And some left the camp 47.
Oh, wow.
The last woman to be released from a mental asylum was in 1959.
Oh, wow.
So, and when I looked through all the images and saw what was happening in that nanosecond, I began to look at the documentation. So what I'm going to do is just take you through very quickly so that we know who these people are and why they are such an important part of our narrative, because they've been silenced. And the silence has been overtaken by the dominant narrative that says it was a happy environment. Okay, so the people who were interned at Tatura, the Malacca Straits Italians, in that group you have a number of families from the Malacca Straits. What I found is the Malacca Straits Italians were all quite well educated and had various talents. We had artists, sculptors, musicians, and industrial chemists. Some of the women were industrial chemists, and they lived on rubber plantations in Malaysia with their young children and husbands, and it was an interesting environment. I do not look at the Italo-Australians, they were a completely different group. The Arab Italian Palestinians were mostly Arab women married to Italian men or men of Italian descent over many generations who had Italian passports. So in some of those households, they didn't even speak Italian. They spoke Arabic or French or both. And then the interethnic Levantine families of Palestine, where, for example, the wife, Elepi, is Greek, he is Italian, Domenico, and this lady, Giovanna, is Jewish German, Jewish Russian, and he is Italian. And this is their servant. So this is Edminia, she's the servant for this family here. So the scenario is quite complex, and yet we know nothing about these people in our local history. Alright, so the storyline goes that they were happy, and these are the sorts of images that are produced to show that they were happy in those camps. Yes, these were the single men in Camp 2, but those single men had just returned from Loveday, which was really Camp 10, which really was quite torturous. So Camp 2 was a lot better than Camp 10. So therefore, that nanosecond captures a certain image. If you look at the image of these children, which of these children are smiling? None. Oh, I've answered that for you. Sorry. boy to the top here, he reappears in other images. And the older the children are, the deeper the emotions. You can see the emotion and the anger in the face. If it were just one image, I'd say, well, you know, that's what it was on the day. But there is more than one image that shows that life in those camps wasn't as wonderful as it's supposed to be. Again, that's what happens to you during the war. You get a tag. And these are the women chemists from the Malacca Straits. They were in the Malaysian rubber plantations. Okay, so what I found in the camps was that the European Italo-Palestinians did not really associate with the Arab mixed ethnicity families. And in fact, the Arab mixed ethnicity families didn't even speak Italian. The documents show that they resented being with the Italians and didn't want anything to do with them. And in fact, a descendant, a person who is a descendant of this family, said that he, you know, to a third person, that this was something that they preferred not to do, not to be with the Italians. So, accommodation from the affluence of Palestine and the Southeast Asia to this sort of accommodation from 1940 to 1946-47. And then we go into the families. Right, so here I go. Today we've got Claudia here, and she's told her story and the torments and sufferings that her family went through in a book that we've just published. It's a collaborative book with 15 stories of Italian Australians and the Italo-Palestinians and Malacca Straits Italians. And her family story is quite unique because her parents' love story is amazing, but that's for a later date. What we have is a family that was in crisis during and after internment, even though this image shows that Phyllis with, is that your brother? Yes. Yeah, with Ricardo are smiling and happy in the camp. That photograph, I think, was taken by Monsignor Panico from the Apostolic Delegate. What you'll see is the children there. None of those children are smiling, and there you have that little boy there. Yeah. Going probably to his class because he's got books in his hands. They prepared their own classes. And what you have is a scenario where, yes, the children were playing, the items were made by the internees themselves. The pram, I think, came along from Singapore with one of the families and was probably shared. And then you have the family after the war. What year was that?
Well, I'm about 18 months there, so I suppose 46, 47.
Yeah. Okay. So, even though it's a beautiful image and they look like a fantastically united family, the sorrow in the eyes of this family, to me, and I don't know if it seems to you, is there. Because they've gone through so much. So, in Rick's story, his family descended from Levantines who'd been in the Levant for many, many generations. And the family was reduced from a very affluent family in Haifa to a family, there are two brothers, the two wives and their children. Two of the boys were sent to the male-only camp at that stage, so you don't have the full family there. And descending into a situation where all of the life savings were used up to support the family in the camps, including the issue of having clothes supplied by the military, well, no, the military didn't supply the clothes. They had to buy their own clothes from their savings. If they had savings, they had to purchase the clothes. And yet all their clothing and all their belongings were left in Palestine. All right, so the family in 1947, certainly there are more smiles there, but within a decade and 15 years, half of that family was already deceased. So Costanza, the young woman at the top there, had died. Aldo, on the end, had died. Anna, the grandmother, just behind the boy in the middle, had died. And as I understand, her sister, I can't remember her name, Giovanna. Giovanna did not recover very well. As is the case also for Phyllis, which is the situation with Claudia's mother. All right, so these two photographs epitomise the situation. And this is where I just summarise everything now. All right, so this is Anna Datodi, the matron of the Datodi household. Her passport photo before the war and during the war. There's nothing I can add to that. Those images say everything. Her eyes say everything. I don't know what it says to you, but to me it says it's finished. It's the end. So the eyewitness testimonies have been silenced because of this happy-chappy idea that, yes, we didn't have torture camps, we didn't have death camps. True, there's no comparison. Yet, there's nothing that's been acknowledged about what has happened to people who were deported, dispossessed of their properties and their chattels, and their livelihoods, and their whole life trajectory was changed because of their deportation by the British. The transgender women and children are unnoticed, even in the archives. Very rarely do you have a single word about the women and children. Transgenerational memory does continue, and I'll say a bit more about that later in the question time. Long-term internalised suffering has resulted, yes, because we have the children of the internees who were internees themselves who have carried it for 70 years or more. Survival of the fittest, political unrest in the camp after the armistice or during the armistice. The camps were like a little Italy. There were disturbances between pro-fascists and anti-fascists, yes, even amongst people who were friends the day before. So families were in crisis during internment, but after release. After they were released into the community, they were just dumped into society. No assistance for accommodation, no assistance for jobs. And those stories are related by these families themselves. The mental health and the physical health of internees really suffered quite dramatically, and the evidence is quite clear in the historical documents. Of course, like everyone else, decades of economic struggle, social submission and disassociation with other Italians was also one of the things that I've noticed. Some of the families just didn't fit in with the post-war wave. They didn't fit in. They weren't like the post-war Italians. Because in fact they were Levantines and they were oriented Italians, so they were living in the Orient. They weren't the farmers from any part of Italy. Okay, some families disintegrated or suffered in silence, yes. In fact, some families just disappeared from the public record altogether. And I've also found a lot of early deaths. Some of those children that you saw in that photograph, they were already dead by 1968, which seems to me quite unusual because they wouldn't have been that old. Economic and social disadvantage, of course, happens after wars, but changes in work and role and personal identity were also challenges that these families needed to deal with. And it was over and above what the migrants had to deal with who were coming into Australia, and also more than the Italians who were already living in Australia, because they had homes to go back to. Right, secrets and family myths abound. I can tell you, the family myths have really allowed families to hide pain. And this is what some of that first generation needed to do. They needed to hide their pain. And yet, for a lot of the families, that pain came through in a different way. There are a lot of women in mental institutions, in and out. There are physical issues, and the men developed a sense of anger. And this anger was predominantly came out during situations at home, where they had to sort of retain themselves as, keep themselves as people with good etiquette in public. It didn't happen at home. So some of the documents do state that the men were heavy smokers. They didn't drink because they couldn't have alcohol. But certainly there was unresolved trauma that came out in different ways. So therefore, just to summarise, the transgenerational memories do show that there's much to be done regarding the integration and assimilation of this group of Italo-Palestinians and Malacca Strait Italians, because in effect they just disappeared into the Australian environment because their histories are dispersed. They were dispersed anyway after release from camp. None of them actually went to live in the same areas, which I find quite interesting as well, because a lot of them were actually sent to work as gardeners in convents, work as assistants somewhere out in the bush, and therefore their identities were dispersed in the actual situation. So there's an actual hut, still exists in Tatura, and I leave you with a few words from Costanza. And this actually joins the two families together, because this poem is found in Claudia's, Phyllis, her mother's little diary, written by Costanza in the camp, and the two families have been close friends for more than 70 years, and here is the evidence. La vita dura di Tatura un giorno finirà, pur separandoci, sorry my Italian, la nostra amicizia per sempre durerà. So they were separated. The Datodi family was in Moonee Ponds, and the Marcella family was in Mornington. I don't know how often they saw each other, but certainly the distance did separate them. And I'll just leave you with another Datodi woman's final summary. I spoke with one of the Datodi descendants a while ago, and she mentioned that for her mother, who died at 98, the war ended on the day she died, not in 1945. And the year that she died was about 5 years ago. So for Matilda Datodi, the war ended then. Okay, thank you.